I found out my sister had already changed the locks on our mother's house, 3 weeks before I found out our mother had even passed. Let that sit with you for a moment, because it took me months to understand how something like that was even possible. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in, the same porch where my mother used to sit every summer evening with a glass of sweet tea, and I watched a locksmith drill through the front door like it belonged to a stranger. I had no idea my mother was gone. I had no idea a woman I had called my best friend for 32 years, my own sister, had already been inside that house, sorting through drawers, boxing up photographs, and quietly removing my name from a piece of paper that represented everything our family had ever built together. I remember the exact sound the drill made against the old brass lock. A lock our father had installed himself the year before he died. A lock that had never once failed us in 20 years. I remember the locksmith glancing at me over his shoulder, confused, because I had pulled into the driveway in the middle of his work, and simply stood there, keys still in my hand, keys that no longer meant anything. I asked him who had hired him. He told me a name I already knew, and something in my chest went cold in a way I had never felt before, not even at the funeral, not even in the hospital hallway the week before that. I was standing in front of my own childhood, and I no longer had a way to get inside it. By the time I learned the truth, the locksmith had already left, the paperwork had already been filed, and my sister had already rehearsed her explanation. I want you to understand something before I go any further. This is not a story about a house. This is not a story about money, even though money will matter more than either of us wanted it to. This is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you decide instead to protect themselves, and how far a person will go when they believe no one is watching. My name is Claire Sutton, and for most of my life, I believed my sister Renee would never do anything to hurt me. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing a parent, and then a completely different kind of grief that comes from realizing, in the same season of your life, that you may have also lost the person who was supposed to help you carry that first grief. I did not know yet, standing on that porch, that I was about to live through both at once. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the ground I had always assumed was steady beneath my feet had quietly given way months earlier, while I was 3 states away, trusting every phone call, every reassurance, every small excuse I had been given without question. I need you to sit with that image for a second. A locksmith at the door of a house that still smelled like your mother's perfume. A house where your childhood height marks were still penciled onto the doorframe of the hallway closet. A house where every window still held the curtains your mother sewed by hand the year you turned 12. Now imagine finding out that someone had already decided you no longer belonged there, and that decision had been made without a single phone call, without a single warning, without a single moment of honesty. That is where this story begins, but it is not where it ends. Before we go any further, I want to tell you exactly how we got here, because nothing about this happened overnight. I want to be honest with you about something else, too. In the days after that moment on the porch, I searched my memory over and over for a warning sign I might have missed. A comment, a look, a hesitation in Renee's voice during one of our calls that I had brushed past too quickly because I was busy, because I trusted her, because the idea that my own sister could do something like this had simply never occurred to me as a possibility worth watching for. I found a few, not many, but enough that later, once I understood the full picture, they would come back to me one by one, each one landing heavier than the last, each one a piece of a puzzle I had not even known I was supposed to be solving. What makes this story difficult to tell is not just what Renee did, but why. Because the easy version of this story would have her as simply cruel, simply greedy, a woman who saw an opportunity in our mother's death and took it without a second thought. I wish it were that simple, because simple things are easier to be angry at and easier to walk away from. What actually happened was far more complicated and far more human, which is exactly what made it so hard for me to forgive, and exactly what I think will stay with you long after this video ends. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how far someone will go to erase you from your own family's history. You are going to understand how a woman who once braided my hair before school, who once stayed up with me the night I lost my first job, who once promised me at our father's funeral that we would always take care of each other, could sit across from a lawyer and sign documents designed to cut me out entirely. You are going to hear the phone calls that were never returned, the excuses that started small and grew larger, and the exact moment I realized the sister I trusted most in this world had been planning this for longer than I ever imagined. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how any of this happened, you first need to understand who my sister and I used to be. Long before locks were changed, and long before lawyers were involved, you need to understand our mother, Eleanor Sutton, a woman who spent 40 years making sure her daughters never had a reason to doubt each other. And you need to understand exactly what was quietly happening in the final months of her life, while I believed everything between us was still exactly the way it had always been. There are 3 questions that followed me through every single day of what came after that morning on the porch, and I want you to hold on to them as I tell you this story, because the answers did not come easily, and some of them did not come the way I expected at all. The first question was simple on its surface, but nearly impossible for me to accept. Why would Renee do this without telling me? We had never kept secrets like this from each other, not even as children, not even during the hardest years of our lives. We had told each other everything, the good and the humiliating, and the things neither of us would have admitted to another living soul, and yet somehow, in the months leading up to our mother's death, she had decided I no longer deserved even the smallest piece of the truth. The second question was harder still, and it is the one I return to even now, long after everything was settled. Did our mother know what Renee was planning, or had Renee acted entirely on her own, using our mother's final months as cover for something she had already decided to do long before anyone got sick? I needed to know whether the woman who raised us, who spent 40 years teaching us to protect each other above everything else, had somehow been pulled into this without my knowledge, or whether she had gone to her grave still believing her daughters were as close as she had always hoped we would be. That question alone was enough to keep me on the phone with relatives for hours, piecing together timelines, comparing memories, trying to reconstruct a version of the truth no one seemed willing to give me directly. The third question is the one that kept me awake most nights while lawyers exchanged letters and family members stopped answering my calls. What was Renee so afraid of that she believed erasing me was easier than simply telling me the truth? Because that is what this really became. Not a disagreement about a house, but a question of what my sister was hiding and how long she had been hiding it. Fear does strange things to people. It convinces them that silence is protection, that avoidance is kindness, that the people who love them most are somehow the ones who need to be shielded from reality the longest. I did not understand that yet, not fully, not while I was still standing in the wreckage of what felt like a simple betrayal. I promise you, by the time this story is finished, you will understand exactly what she was running from, and you will understand why the truth, when it finally came out, was almost harder to hear than the betrayal itself. There were nights during this process where I genuinely believed I had lost my sister forever, not just to a legal dispute over property, but to whatever secret was large enough to make her choose silence over me. But to understand any of that, I need to take you back to where Renee and I actually started, back before lawyers, before locksmiths, back to a small house on Larkspur Avenue where none of this would have seemed possible. Renee is 2 years older than me, and for most of my childhood, she was the closest thing I had to a second mother. Our father passed away when I was 9 years old, and in the years that followed, our mother worked 2 jobs to keep our house on Larkspur Avenue standing, the same house that would later become the center of everything that tore us apart. Renee stepped into a role no 12-year-old should have had to carry. She walked me to school, she helped me with homework at the kitchen table, long after our mother had fallen asleep exhausted on the couch, and she made sure I never once felt like I was raising myself. I loved her the way you love someone who has quietly sacrificed pieces of their own childhood for yours. And for most of my life, I never questioned whether that love was returned in equal measure. I still remember specific evenings from that time with a clarity that surprises me even now. Renee braiding my hair on the edge of her bed while quizzing me on spelling words for a test the next morning. Renee walking 3 blocks in the rain to bring me a forgotten umbrella outside the middle school gymnasium, soaked through by the time she got there, laughing about it instead of complaining. There was a version of my sister in those years that felt almost limitless in her patience, a version I carried with me into adulthood as proof that whatever else happened in life, Renee would always be someone I could depend on completely. It is strange looking back how much of my sense of safety in the world was quietly built on the assumption that my sister would never change. Our mother, Eleanor Sutton, built that house into something more than 4 walls and a roof. She planted the rose bushes along the side fence herself. She repainted the kitchen 3 different shades of yellow over the decades because she said the color reminded her of hope. And she hosted every single holiday, every birthday, every difficult family conversation at that same worn kitchen table. She was not a wealthy woman, but she was fiercely proud of what she had built, and she often told us that the house was never really about the house at all. It was about having one place in the world where her daughters would always know they belonged, no matter how far life carried them or how complicated things became between them. Renee married young, to a man named Mark Delaney, a contractor who our mother liked well enough but never fully trusted, though she never explained why. I remember asking her about it once, gently, and she only said that some people carry their worry quietly, and that Mark struck her as someone who did exactly that. I moved 2 states away for a nursing career I had worked hard to build, and Renee stayed close to home, which our mother often described, gently but pointedly, as Renee being the responsible one. I never resented that description, though I sometimes wondered privately whether Renee did, whether some quiet part of her felt as though she had sacrificed the version of her own life she might have chosen, in order to remain the daughter who stayed. Looking back now, I can see the small moments I dismissed at the time, moments that meant nothing on their own, but added up to something I never let myself examine closely. There was the Thanksgiving Renee mentioned, almost as a joke, that the house should probably just go to whoever was around to take care of it. There was the birthday call, where our mother mentioned Mark's business had been struggling, and Renee quickly changed the subject before I could ask more. There was a growing distance in Renee's voice during our phone calls in the 2 years before our mother's health began to decline, a distance I told myself was simply exhaustion, because Renee had always carried more weight than she let anyone see. I did not know yet that weight had turned into desperation, and desperation was about to change everything. There was one more moment I did not understand at the time, a conversation at a family barbecue about a year before our mother's diagnosis, when Mark mentioned offhandedly that construction permits in the county had gotten harder to secure, and that a couple of his bigger jobs had fallen through. Renee had laughed it off at the time, told everyone not to worry, that things always evened out eventually. I remember thinking nothing of it, the way you think nothing of a single loose thread on a sweater, never imagining that thread was already unraveling something much larger beneath the surface, something that would eventually pull our entire family apart at the seams. 18 months before our mother passed, she was diagnosed with a heart condition that required increasing levels of care. Renee, living only 20 minutes from the house, became our mother's primary caregiver, and I supported from a distance, flying in every few weeks, handling medical research and insurance calls, sending money whenever it was needed. I trusted Renee completely with our mother's daily care, and I never once imagined that trust was being used as cover for something else entirely. Our mother's decline was slow, then sudden, the way these things often are, and in the final 3 months of her life, Renee began limiting my visits, always with a reasonable-sounding excuse. Mom is too tired for visitors this week. Mom had a rough night. Let's wait until she's stronger. I believed every single word, because believing anything else would have meant questioning the one person I had never questioned in my entire life. Our mother passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, and I did not find out until Thursday evening, nearly 48 hours later, when a cousin, not Renee, called to offer condolences she assumed I had already received. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, unable to process why my own sister had not called me the moment our mother took her last breath. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a piece of news like that, a silence where your body understands before your mind catches up. And I remember gripping the edge of the counter, waiting for the room to feel steady again before I could even dial Renee's number. When I finally reached Renee, her voice was calm in a way that felt rehearsed rather than grieving. She apologized, blamed the chaos of the funeral home, the flood of arrangements, and I accepted it, because grief makes you forgive things you might otherwise question. Looking back, I think some part of me already sensed something was wrong in that call. In the careful way she chose her words, in how quickly she moved the conversation toward logistics, rather than allowing either of us a moment to simply mourn together for the funeral 3 days later, and it was there, standing in the same house I grew up in, that I first noticed small things had already changed. A few pieces of furniture were missing. Certain drawers in our mother's bedroom were empty. The funeral itself is a blur to me now, except for a few sharp details that never faded. Renee standing slightly apart from me during the service, accepting condolences from our mother's old neighbors with a composed, practiced grace that felt unfamiliar. Mark hovering near the back of the room for most of the afternoon, checking his phone more than seemed appropriate for the occasion. And our mother's favorite reading chair, the one she had kept by the living room window for as long as I could remember, already gone from its usual spot, replaced by an empty patch of carpet, slightly lighter than the floor around it. I did not ask about the chair that day. I wish now that I had. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid, and I let it go. I returned home after the funeral, promising Renee we would sit down together within the month to sort out our mother's affairs, the house, the small savings, the modest life insurance policy our mother had kept current for decades. 3 weeks passed with no word from Renee beyond short, distracted texts, each one a little more clipped than the last, each one leaving me with the sense that she was managing me rather than communicating with me. When I finally called to schedule that conversation, she told me, almost casually, that she had already spoken with a lawyer and started the process of transferring the deed. She said it as if this were something we had already agreed upon, as if my presence in the conversation had simply been optional. I remember the exact moment the floor seemed to tilt beneath me, because I realized my sister had been moving forward without me for far longer than 3 weeks. That was when I flew back to Larkspur Avenue unannounced, and that is when I found the locksmith at the door, drilling into the frame our mother had painted yellow with her own hands. Renee stood on the lawn, arms crossed, and when I asked her what was happening, she did not deny it. She told me, in a voice stripped of the warmth I had known my entire life, that the house needed to be secured, that decisions had to be made quickly, and that she had already spoken to a lawyer about removing my name from any future claim to the property. I asked her why. I asked her, standing on our mother's lawn with a stranger drilling through our mother's front door, why she would do this to me without a single conversation. Renee looked at me for a long moment, and for just a second, I saw something behind her eyes that looked almost like relief, as if part of her had been waiting for this confrontation, and another part of her was terrified of what would happen once it actually arrived. But whatever that flicker was, it disappeared quickly, replaced by the same guarded composure she had carried since the funeral. She said only that I would not understand, and then she got into her car and drove away, leaving me standing alone on the lawn of the house where I had learned to ride a bicycle, the house where our mother had tucked us both into the same bed during thunderstorms, now nothing more than a construction site for a stranger, changing locks against my own name. In the weeks that followed, I learned that grief and anger can occupy the same body without ever canceling each other out. I hired an attorney, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Hayes, who explained that our mother had died without a formal, updated will, which meant the house should have legally passed to both of us in equal shares under state inheritance law. Renee's attempt to transfer the deed solely into her name required my signature, a signature she did not have, which meant her lawyer had likely relied on either a misunderstanding of the law or a deliberate gamble that I would not fight back. Patricia filed to halt any transfer immediately, and within days, what had been a private family wound became a formal legal dispute, complete with letters, deadlines, and a courthouse date that made the entire situation feel unbearably real. I remember sitting in Patricia's office for the first time, staring at a folder with my sister's name printed on the tab, and feeling a version of grief I had not expected. A grief not for our mother this time, but for whatever version of Renee I had believed existed for 32 years. Patricia was kind but direct, the kind of person who had clearly seen family disputes like this before and knew exactly how much they could cost people, not just financially, but in every other sense of the word. She told me plainly that we could likely win the legal argument without much difficulty, but she also warned me that winning a legal argument and repairing a relationship were two entirely different battles, and that I needed to decide early on which one actually mattered more to me. Extended family began taking sides almost immediately, which was, in some ways, more painful than the dispute with Renee itself. Our cousin Todd, who had always been close to Renee, told me privately that I should simply let her have the house, that she had done the hard work of caregiving and deserved it. I remember the sting of that conversation, not because Todd was entirely wrong about the caregiving, but because it revealed how easily people were willing to rewrite the story into something simpler than it actually was. A story where I was the outsider, making unreasonable demands, rather than a daughter who had simply been left in the dark. Our Aunt Susan, our mother's younger sister, quietly reached out to tell me she had noticed strange changes in Renee's behavior over the past year, mentioning that Mark's construction business had lost 2 major contracts and that she had overheard tense conversations about money during a visit the previous winter. It was the first real thread I had toward understanding why any of this was happening, and I pulled at it carefully, unsure yet where it would lead. Through the discovery process required by the legal filing, Patricia uncovered records showing Mark Delaney's company had taken out 3 separate loans in the 18 months before our mother passed, all of them now significantly overdue, with a lien threatened against Renee and Mark's own home. Seeing those documents for the first time felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself against my will, each piece confirming a picture I had not wanted to believe. It became increasingly clear that Renee had not acted out of greed in the way I had first assumed, in my angriest moments, but out of fear of losing everything she and Mark had built, fear of admitting to me, or to anyone, that their finances had quietly collapsed. That did not excuse what she had done, but it began to reshape the question I had been asking from the very beginning. This was never really about the house. It was about what Renee was willing to hide and who she was willing to sacrifice to keep her own life from falling apart in front of the people she loved most. The court ordered mediation before allowing the case to proceed further. A single room, a long table, Renee on one side with her attorney, myself and Patricia on the other, a mediator between us, trying to hold the entire fractured history of our family together with nothing but patience and procedure. I remember walking into that room and barely recognizing my own sister, not because she looked different, but because the distance between us had grown into something that felt almost physical, a wall neither of us seemed to know how to speak across anymore. It was in that room that Renee finally said out loud what Aunt Susan had only suspected. Mark's business was not simply struggling, it was collapsing entirely, and creditors had begun threatening legal action that would have taken their own home if they could not produce a significant sum of money within a matter of months. Renee's voice broke twice while she explained it, the first time I had seen her cry since the funeral, and something about that broke something in me too, some final piece of anger I had been holding on to like armor. She told the room that she had planned to quietly sell our mother's house, use the proceeds to save her marriage and her family's stability, and pay me back my half discreetly afterward, believing, in her words, that I would never actually agree to sell if I understood the full situation and had time to consider it emotionally rather than urgently. She said she had convinced herself, somewhere in the middle of her own panic, that protecting me from the truth was somehow the same thing as protecting our relationship, when in reality, it had nearly destroyed it entirely. I sat across that table and felt something shift inside me that I had not expected. Anger, yes, because what Renee had done was still a betrayal, still a decision made entirely without my voice in it. But underneath the anger was something closer to heartbreak, because my sister, the same woman who had raised me at 12 years old, had been carrying a crisis alone for over a year, too ashamed to tell even me, believing isolation was safer than honesty. Then came the second revelation, delivered quietly by Patricia after reviewing additional paperwork Renee's own attorney had been required to disclose. Our mother had, in fact, updated her wishes 8 months before her passing, not through a formal will, but through a signed letter left with her longtime family friend and neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, a letter our mother had asked to be shared with both of us together, a request Renee had never honored. Mrs. Alvarez brought the letter to mediation herself, at Patricia's request, arriving quietly in a cardigan I remembered our mother complimenting years earlier, holding an envelope that had clearly been kept somewhere safe and undisturbed for months. Reading our mother's handwriting for the first time in months undid something in both Renee and me that neither of us had prepared for. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered, evidence of how far her illness had already progressed by the time she wrote it, and somehow that small detail made every word feel heavier. Our mother had written that she knew about Mark's financial troubles, that Renee had confided in her quietly during one of their final visits together, and that our mother, rather than choosing sides, had wanted the house sold if it ever came to that point, with the proceeds split evenly, so that both of her daughters could build stability wherever their lives were heading. She wrote that she trusted us to find our way back to each other, even if the road there was difficult, because she believed, more than anything, that we needed one another more than we needed a house on Larkspur Avenue. Renee read that final line out loud herself, her voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time since the funeral, I reached across the table and took my sister's hand, not because everything was suddenly forgiven, but because in that moment, we were finally grieving our mother together instead of separately, which was something neither of us had allowed ourselves to do until then. The case did not end in a courtroom victory for either of us, because in the end, there was nothing left to fight over. The house was sold 3 months later, the proceeds split evenly, exactly as our mother had requested, and Renee used her half to stabilize what remained of Mark's business, while quietly beginning the slow work of rebuilding trust between us. I will not tell you that everything healed easily, because it did not, and there are still moments where the memory of that locksmith drilling into our mother's front door returns to me uninvited. But I will tell you that Renee and I talk now, carefully, honestly, in a way we never had to before all of this happened, because honesty was never something either of us had been forced to practice until the alternative nearly destroyed us both. I still think about that letter sometimes, about how our mother, even in her final months, understood something about her daughters that neither of us fully understood about ourselves. That fear makes people do things love would never allow, and that the truth, however painful, is almost always kinder in the long run than the silence we use to protect ourselves from it. There are still afternoons when I drive past Larkspur Avenue, past a house that belongs to someone else now, with different curtains in the windows and a different color on the door, and I feel a strange mixture of loss and peace that I am not sure will ever fully resolve itself, and I have come to believe that is simply what it means to survive something like this, with the people you love still standing beside you. I want to ask you something before you go. If you were in my position, standing on that lawn, watching a stranger change the locks on your own mother's house, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have been able to forgive the way I eventually did? Or would some decisions simply be too far to come back from? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and if this story meant something to you, do not forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.